There's a few things I need to explain to you before this makes sense, but this is part of a two-part series, one of which will be taken from the American European perspective and the other from the periphery. My inspiration for this is the core periphery model, where there are some countries that have basically control of the money and the ideas and so on and so forth, and they normally take advantage of the periphery. So today we'll talk about this core, and then the next session will be on the periphery. Sorry about that. The other concept I need to make sure you understand is the idea of polarity. And polarity in international relations means how many countries are essentially in power. A power center is, in this case, called a pole. The argument is at any one time there can be a unipolar setup with one country, a bipolar with two, or a multipolar with several. And when it comes to the 20th century, we start off in a very multipolar world that's dominated by European elitism and industrialization. It still is multipolar, though, because Europe isn't one thing. The different European empires are going to have issues with each other, which we'll talk about here in just a second. The other thing with industrialization is we're starting to see some of the issues with industrialization and capitalism. The idea of socialism is going to be created in the 1800s and is going to be actually practiced in some places in the 1900s. We also have seen the issues of capitalists really running roughshod over their workers in different countries. And so, one of which you'll learn about in AP US history with Theodore Roosevelt and how he takes on the monopolies and trusts which were created. However, with these different empires, European empires and around them, they're going to eventually create a war with each other, which they're going to call the Great War, which we now know as World War One. And several consequences to World War I, just as a reminder, is we're going to have 20 million people die just in these battles, which is going to be sad. Communism is going to rise violently in Russia, which will be important here in just a little bit. The great, powerful Germany is going to be placed with a bunch of the war guilt and war reparations to try to help the Allies kind of get back the money that they spent during the war. The United States emerges as an important power, but not the world power yet, not a quote unquote superpower. And unfortunately, a lot of national lines are not only going to be redrawn, but there's going to be a lot of disappointed or dissolved empires, and there's going to be a lot of hard feelings which are going to boil over into the next World War. But don't worry, it gets worse. In the interwar years, there's also going to be a pandemic where another 20 million people are going to die around the world. There's going to be an initial kind of wave, and then as that dies down, World War I is going to end, and those soldiers are going to return back to their countries. And in the jubilation of that, we're going to forget our masks and social distancing, and then have a much bigger wave of people dying. And so that's going to be an issue that's going to cause a lot of disillusionment. Another thing that's going to happen is the American economy is going to surge after World War I, and then through a lot of different things which we talked about before the quarantine, things are going to backfire, and that's going to start a worldwide depression. So, as I mentioned before, a lot of disillusionment that's going to be happening with these empires, with democracy and capitalism, which is going to bring a rise to some totalitarian regimes. Now, the two big ones which are going to come up are going to be communism and fascism. Now, from the outside, they look the same because they're totalitarian. The government takes control totally. Again, there usually is a figurehead who has incredible amounts of power, has a secret or not so secret police that kind of enforces what he wants. And then there's censorship and indoctrination that all kind of makes everyone have to say on the outside that they agree with the figurehead. However, at their hearts, communism and fascism are very different. Communism is ultimate reaction to capitalism. So its goal is to create a strong and equal society without the classes which are inherent in capitalism. For communism to work, they have to take over the world so that they can, so the government can make sure everything is fair. The people who tend to go towards communist ideas normally are people who are idealists. So on paper, communism looks great, doesn't really work in the real world, but it looks great on paper. The other people who tend to move towards communism are people who are at a big disadvantage, people who are generationally poor, who don't see any way that they're going to be able to take care of themselves if a big world government doesn't help them. Now, what happens is that as communism is created in Russia, it's an incredibly bloody transformation, which gets a lot of other people scared of communism in Europe, and so they start to turn to something that we would call fascism. Again, totalitarian, looks very similar from the outside, but this is preserving a strong society based off of merit. It creates classes of people based on how much use they can be. And fascism isn't necessarily concerned about taking care of people or taking care of the world. It's concerned about taking care of that nation or that empire. The people who tend to support fascism are people who are nationalists at heart, who want their country or empire to be far and away better than anyone else. Industrialists and other people who feel like they can make it on their own, who feel like they're strong enough, smart enough, that they can survive kind of they can survive and prove their worth to society. Okay, and this leads to World War II, which is usually a very fun thing for me to teach, but we don't have time. So there's all sorts of things that are happening here. Again, there are other videos you can look at. The other huge part, which I'm not going to get to really talk to you about, um, is the Holocaust, which is happening at the same time. And so it's going to be an incredibly bloody conflict, very difficult. And to sum it up, I like to use a Star Wars analogy. So you can find other videos to kind of get the more detailed version, but um, I've noticed that it really kind of fits the original trilogy of Star Wars. So if you don't know the original trilogy, and a big evil empire tries to take over the universe, and at the end of the first Star Wars movie, a young, inexperienced, peppy Luke Skywalker is going to come in and help to put the rebellion over the top and defeat this empire. The second movie is called The Empire Strikes Back, and so what happens is that that evil empire rebounds, rebuilds, and looks like it wins by the end of the second movie. It even goes as far as to cut off the main hero, Luke Skywalker's hand at the very end, crippling him. But then we have the end of the trilogy, which is the Return of the Jedi. So Luke returns after fixing himself up, uh, joins the rebellion again, and helps to defeat the evil empire, even redeeming the bad guy. So, how does that fit in with the World Wars? Well, the first stage is really kind of like World War One. We've got the empire, which could be the Central Powers, and they and the rebellion or the Allies get into a stalemate, and then the U.S. comes in at the end of the World War and basically puts the Allies over the top. Okay, after World War One, what's going to happen is some of the people who are most upset at how World War One ended, Germany, Japan, and Italy, create this new empire called the Axis power, and they almost win. They take over the vast majority of Europe. They take over big amounts of Asia. And what ends up happening is even before the US gets involved, Japan attacks the United States. They cut off our naval hand. They attack Pearl Harbor and destroy a lot of our Navy. However, the United States bounces back from that. They bounce back and they start to take on Japan, and then um, as they're making some headway there and things are looking good there, they go to the European theater as well and help defeat the Axis power. Um, and just to make it a total Star Wars analogy, they even redeemed part of Germany. So they create a legacy with West Germany. West Germany is going to be split here in a second, and we'll see why. And that is really the legacy of modern Germany, and not the East Germany as well. Now, after World War II, there's some lessons that we feel like that we've learned. That's important to note. Is that before the war, we have this huge depression, and one of the things we start to realize is that capitalism really does need to have its limits. That business people and industrialists always want to push the envelope, but it can be pushed too much, and so there seems to be some benefit in having some kind of big government involved. Another huge lesson is that you can't negotiate with evil. You know, when a terrorist tries to negotiate with you, you just don't. You've got to stand against them. And the other thing is it got rid of, at least for a large amount for quite a few decades, gets rid of this idea that the United States can hide out, that the world is truly seen as interconnected, and you can't just wait for things to happen. And so this is going to be a start of the United States really getting involved with other countries throughout the world. Um, but the biggest consequences of all of World War II is going to be the Cold War. So we're going to move from a multipolar world into a bipolar one with two main superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. So what is the Cold War? The Cold War was an era of global confrontation and competition between two incompatible systems, uh, one of which headed by the Soviet Union with communism trying to take over the world, and the United States being the polar opposite, trying to spread democratic capitalism. And again, like World War II, there's a tons of things here that I could talk about, but I'm just going to give you the highlights of it. There's other videos you can find, which will go through the step by step. When it comes to the continuities of what happens throughout this entire Cold War, throughout this entire 50-year period, is that it never gets quote unquote hot. The reason why it never gets hot is because, and by that I mean the Soviet Union and the United States are never going to stand nose to nose on a battlefield and try to defeat each other. One of the reasons why is because whenever you're at war, you eventually have to take out your most destructive weapons. And in this case, that means nuclear weapons and hydrogen bombs and other weapons of huge mass destruction. Through this, we're going to have so many of these weapons that what's going to happen is if we were to fire a missile at Russia, they would fire some back and we would fire them, and we would have mutually assured destruction. So since we don't want to destroy the planet and each other and all the people within it, we're going to have a lot of proxy wars, which means that instead of the countries fighting each other directly, they're going to fund enemies for the other side. So when we take on, for instance, like in Vietnam or Korea, what will happen is the Americans and capitalists and Europeans will fund one side, and then the Soviets will fund the other. Okay. The other thing that we have is we're going to have huge amounts of competition when it comes to technology, some of which is going to be military. Um, and in the middle of an arm race, it's a very destructive, difficult time, and it forces a lot of innovation. Because again, if you come in with a knife in the middle of an arms race, then they're going to come back with a gun. And then you just can't build a gun. You've got to build something that's better than a gun. So let's say a bomb, and then the other side has to say, wait a second, we need something better than the bomb. We'll make a missile, and then it just keeps going and going and going, and you just make the best and most destructive things possible. The space race is also going to happen as well, as seen as a more positive idea, and that's going to cause us to basically both sides to look outside of the Earth itself. The other thing that I mentioned is that we're going to have a bipolar world. Basically, the world's going to be kind of split into basically two teams. You're either allied with the first world, which is the U.S. and Europe and capitalism, Western Europe and capitalism. The second world will be the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and communism. And then everybody else will be in the third world, kind of in between those two powers. Sometimes they'll be played, sometimes they will play the superpowers against each other. But that's where the idea of the third world comes from. Now, a lot of the third world doesn't necessarily have a lot of money, which is why today, when you hear third world, you probably think of not a very strong or not very economically rich country. But the Cold War is going to go over about 4 to 5 decades, and that's going to match into basically 4 stages. The first stage is going to be containment. And the idea from the U.S. perspective is to try to contain communism in as few countries as possible. So as the Soviet Union marches through Europe, basically all the areas of Europe they liberate are going to become communist. And so at the end of World War II, one of the big questions is, wait a second, we had America and Europe coming from the Western Europe, coming from the West in Germany, and then the Soviets are coming from the East, and then they meet in Germany. And the question was were they going to immediately start fighting? And the answer was no, thankfully through the Yalta Conference and other areas. And what we realize is that, hey, we don't want communism to spread, but we're not gonna try to force a country not to be communist. Now, the big thing about containment, though, is we want to avoid this, which on the bottom of the screen you see is the domino theory. So from the American perspective, it's going to be scary. We have this big violent revolution in Russia, and then China's going to become communist, and then part of Korea, and then part of Vietnam. And the question becomes, is the communism just going to roll through the rest of the world and eventually take over the United States? So some of the key components is not only this um, domino theory, but it's different things like NATO, a big military organization to fight against communism, Marshall Plan. Uh, the Iron Curtain is going to go down, and so we're going to have issues with Berlin, and so that's the first part, just kind of containment. After some confrontations, we realized that, gee, we might actually have to go to war with each other, and so that's going to lead into the 50s and 60s with the idea of brinkmanship, which is the idea is that you have got to go to the brink of war to protect your interest. Again, this is the idea, one of the lessons we learned from World War II is you can't just give in to an aggressor. So some of the key components of this era is going to be a Berlin Wall. So the city of Berlin is going to be split, just like Germany will be split between the democracies, the capitalists and the communists. And we're also going to have a lot of issues in Cuba, which becomes communist as well, which we'll learn about in the next slideshow. We honestly probably shouldn't be here today because that is going to get so contentious. We're going to have the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we almost are going to have a nuclear war. The other part of brinkmanship is going to be the Vietnam War, where Vietnam's going to be split between communist and capitalist, and both sides are going to want their side to win. And eventually what this gives way to is in the 1970s is something called Détente. Now, Détente is going to be kind of a reversal of what we've done before because the Cold War is going to be incredibly expensive and we're going to almost blow up each other. And so what's going to end up happening is Richard Nixon, you can see here, is one of the people, the president most associated with this. And so we're going to start to make talks with the Soviet Union. We're going to start to talk about maybe lowering our arsenal. The United States is going to find their way out of the Vietnam War. And just to make sure that the Soviet Union kind of plays with us, the United States is going to start to work with China a little bit, start diplomatic relations with them, just to keep the Soviet Union off guard. So this leads, that decade is going to lead to the 80s and 90s, and that's when the final confrontation is going to happen. You see, as the 1980s start, it's going to start to become clear that when it comes to as an economic system for the best products at the lowest prices, capitalism is by far the way to go. The innovation is much greater. It tends to spread the wealth better in many ways than flat out communism does. And so as Ronald Reagan, who's the president at the time, takes a look at the technology, realizes that the Soviet Union is having issues feeding its own people, it's going to realize that, we can end this. And one of the ways he's going to do that is through continuous confrontation, and he's going to bank on the goodwill that our economy has built for us and create huge amounts of deficit spending. He is going to increase the national deficit by 184%. And partially with the idea of we've got to overwhelm the Soviets, we've got to bankrupt them. And it works. The Soviets are having all sorts of issues, and they get involved in Afghanistan, which we'll learn about in the next slideshow. And the United States starts talking about a program called Star Wars, which is an incredibly expensive, like laser missile thing that we start to look into. And again, from the Soviet perspective, they're having issues. Their economy isn't working. It's not as robust as the capitalists are. And so the Soviets start looking into things called glasnost, which is openness, and perestroika, which is restructuring. And originally the whole idea is that the leader at the time was Gorbachev. And the idea is like, okay, we're a totalitarian government. No one can say anything bad against us. we need to start getting better ideas. We need to start opening up the intellectualism. And he tries to open it an inch, and once he does, the whole door flies open. Because as people realize, oh, they can say what's wrong with the system, they do. As they start learning about what's happening in other parts of the world, they get more and more upset at how much further along the capitalists are, and they want to switch to that. Also, this entire empire the Soviets had created with the Baltic states and all these states around Russia and through Eastern Europe, they are going to demand being separated from the Soviet Union because they want what capitalism can't provide. Even China is going to have issues with Tiananmen Square, which we'll talk about. And so what ends up happening um, is communism doesn't end with a huge military fight. It ends with a whimper as it becomes clear that the people just are not going to support communism. And so what happens is uh, by the midpoint essentially of George Bush's, not George W. Bush, but his father's term, Reagan is going to put huge pressures on the Soviet Union, and it's going to collapse during uh, Bush's first and only presidential run. He's going to there's going to be a conference in Malta, and then there's also going to be a call on Christmas Day on in December 1991, where the Gorbachev admits that the Soviet Union is no more. So hey, we win, right? Great idea, and we're in a unipolar world. However, some big questions start to arise pretty quickly. Capitalism wins, but the question becomes, well, does the United States? Because again, capitalism gives us the best products at the lowest prices, but it also creates a lot of losers. You have the best products at the lowest prices because if you don't have the best products at a price that people are willing to pay, then you get nothing. There's no real built in social net. And so we're still trying to figure out what to do in those situations. So the United States is the only superpower in the world, but um, but very quickly the European Union is formed, which is going to provide a huge economic challenge to the United States. Um, then China is going to we'll talk about this next time, but they're going to start to open up their economy, and that's going to cause some potentials for opportunities and also issues. And it's a big burden to hold. The United States, at first, for many presidents, embraces this idea of being a real leader amongst the world, and that comes with a lot of responsibility and a lot of hands which are expecting help from you. And so the United States kind of wrestles with where should they get involved and where shouldn't they get involved. Before, you always just did something against the communists, but if there's no communists, then, well, who do I have to get involved with? What do I have to stop? And on the other side, you also has communism loses, but does Russia? And in some ways, Russia has a really tough decade or two after after the fall of communism. They're going to have a huge transition from communist to capitalist, and unfortunately, that's going to give rise to an oligarchy. Oligarchy means rule of the few. So in communism, everyone owns everything, which means no one owns anything. The government does. And so what they do is they essentially are going to sell off parts of their infrastructure and their industries to people. And so they give everyone basically stock options, which they'll be able to buy however they'd like. And they start auctioning off industries and companies that are owned by the government. Small problem. The communist leaders who were in charge and the mafia, which had been the Russian mafia, which had been growing at this time, starts essentially cheating. They start pressuring and stealing these stock options from people. These This is pre-internet, and so these auctions that end up happening from on some key Russian industries are basically sold. Dates and times are changed. Auctions happen before they should have happened, or in different places, and so some people, these people who are now going to be known as oligarchs, are going to basically get huge amounts of the Russian economy. And so as we get into like the 2010s, things consolidate under Putin, who basically gains control of these oligarchs, um, and he stabilizes. Russia in many ways, but these oligarchs are really in charge. And what we've seen recently over the past, especially 5 years or so, is Russia has started to flex their muscles. They've been starting to build up their military again. They have been doing of a huge amount of um, work through social engineering and programming and social media to influence what happens in other countries. Um, so again, whether you're a fan of Donald Trump or not, um, whether he wanted help from them or not, we've seen and we've proven that there have been these Russian troll farms who basically have tried to control not only influence, not control, tried to influence information and how people feel about leaders in the United States and also leaders in different parts. Some of these troll farms also have been active in Britain, and they were pushing propaganda to leave the EU. And so it appears that Russia has been trying to interfere to hopefully try to kind of bring down some of the world superpowers down to their level. Whether they'll be successful, we'll see. So the question still becomes: okay, is there a unipolar argument? Is Are we living in a unipolar world? Well, you could say the United States is still, even at this point, we're still the most powerful country in the world. We have some definite competition starting to rise up. But the thing is, it's just not all Americans. Is capitalism creates wealth stratification, both between nations and also within nations. There is a growing theory that there is this new group of the rich, kind of like the oligarchs in Russia, but people in the United States and people in Britain and so on and so forth, whose wealth is so big they're basically above the law. They're able to move their money because capitalism is one. You can basically move your money wherever you want. And so what's happened is that some people would argue that, yeah, we're in a unipolar world, but it's this exclusively rich, these highly rich people who are basically the ones who are running things behind the scenes. It's a socialist argument, up to you whether you believe in it or not, but I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of it. The other argument is that we aren't in a unipolar world, though, but we're basically in a multipolar world. And as you can see here on this map, you can look at the world GDP, and the winners of the Cold War, the United States and the EU, which is basically Western Europe, have about half of the world's wealth. And the other half of the world's wealth, about a quarter of it, are with these BRIC countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And then the rest of the GDP is kind of split amongst the last third. And so this kind of brings the question of, well, do we have a multipolar world anymore? And some people think that we are moving more towards that, especially with China as they're growing and as they're making moves with the new Silk Road. And so I'll tell you about that next slideshow. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the next few decades. Thanks for listening.